Denver, Colorado, February 2021. The city wore winter like an expensive coat, cold, elegant, polished. Snow fell softly over the glass towers of downtown, muffling the usual urban noise into something almost peaceful. But beneath that tranquil surface, something dark was stirring. On the morning of February 14th, Valentine's Day, a cleaning crew arrived at the residences at the Ritz-Carlton, Denver. They were scheduled for their usual maintenance of the penthouse suite on the 38th floor, home to Robert Bobby Mancuso, one of Denver's most respected businessmen and philanthropists. The crew knocked. No answer. They called his phone. Straight to voicemail. After 20 minutes of waiting, building management used the master key. What they found changed everything. Bobby Mancuso lay sprawled across the marble floor of his living room, lifeless. Blood had pooled beneath his head, staining the white Italian tile he'd personally selected during the penthouse renovation 3 years prior. His body was cold. The coroner would later estimate he'd been dead for at least 12 hours. The penthouse was immaculate. No signs of forced entry, no shattered glass, no overturned furniture. Everything looked exactly as it should, except for the body and a half-empty bottle of scotch on the coffee table. 2 glasses sat beside it, both used. One bore Bobby's fingerprints. The other had been wiped clean. News spread like wildfire. By noon, local stations were broadcasting breaking news alerts. By evening, the story had gone national. Bobby Mancuso wasn't just any businessman. He was a pillar of Denver society, founder of Mancuso Development Group, responsible for revitalizing entire neighborhoods, a major donor to children's hospitals, art museums, and veterans' charities. His name was carved into plaques across the city. Politicians sought his endorsement. Galas competed for his attendance. But those who knew Denver's history understood something the headlines didn't mention. Bobby Mancuso carried a legacy that went far deeper than real estate and charity dinners. His grandfather, Salvatore Mancuso, had emigrated from Sicily in 1948 and built a small empire in the meatpacking district of Chicago. By the 1960s, the Mancuso name was whispered in connection with the outfit, Chicago's powerful Italian-American crime syndicate. Salvatore was never convicted of anything serious, but the rumors never died either. When federal pressure intensified in the 1980s, the family quietly moved operations westward. Bobby's father settled in Denver, laundering money through construction companies and gradually transitioning into legitimate business. By the time Bobby took over in the early 2000s, the Mancuso empire was clean, or at least it appeared that way. He was the golden child, the one who'd gone to Wharton, who rubbed shoulders with governors and CEOs, who'd successfully scrubbed the family name of its bloody past. Or so everyone believed. The Denver Police Department assigned the case to Detective Maria Santos, a 15-year veteran known for her tenacity and her ability to navigate political pressure. From day one, she sensed this wouldn't be simple. The crime scene was too clean, the victim too prominent, and the silence from his inner circle too deliberate. Bobby's office was located in Lodo, Denver's historic lower downtown district. Detective Santos and her team spent days combing through files, computers, and financial records. What they discovered painted a complicated picture. On the surface, Mancuso Development Group was thriving. Recent projects included luxury condos in Cherry Creek and a mixed-use development near Union Station. But beneath the polished presentations and glossy brochures, there were irregularities. Payments to offshore accounts, unexplained cash withdrawals, consulting fees paid to companies that didn't seem to exist. Bobby's personal assistant, a sharp woman named Linda Ortiz, who'd worked for him for over a decade, was cooperative but visibly shaken. She described Bobby as driven, demanding, but generous. He never raised his voice. He remembered birthdays. He asked about her kids. But when Detective Santos asked about Bobby's personal relationships, Linda hesitated. He kept things private, she said carefully, especially family matters. What about friends? Santos pressed. Linda's expression shifted slightly. There was one person Bobby trusted more than anyone, his attorney, Christopher Delka. They went back years. Bobby called him his brother, Christopher Delka. The name appeared everywhere in Bobby's life. Co-signer on bank accounts, listed as executor of his will, emergency contact at hospitals, witness on legal documents. The two men had met at the University of Denver Law School in the late 1990s. While Bobby eventually left law to join the family business, Chris completed his degree and built a successful practice specializing in corporate law and real estate transactions. For over 20 years, Chris had been Bobby's closest confidant, his legal shield, and his most trusted advisor. On February 16th, Detective Santos sat across from Christopher Dalka in his office on the 25th floor of Republic Plaza, Denver's tallest building. Chris was 48 years old, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, with graying temples that gave him a distinguished air. His office overlooked the city, floor-to-ceiling windows framing the Rocky Mountains in the distance. He appeared devastated. His eyes were red-rimmed. His voice cracked when he spoke about Bobby. "He was my best friend," Chris said quietly. "I can't believe he's gone." Detective Santos observed him carefully. Grief was difficult to fake, but not impossible. She asked Chris to walk through the last time he'd seen Bobby alive. Thursday night, February 11th. We had dinner at Garden Grace, a high-end steakhouse in downtown Denver. We were celebrating. Bobby had just closed a major deal with a development firm out of California. $20 million. It was supposed to be the beginning of something huge. How did he seem? Happy? Relieved? He'd been stressed for months about financing. This deal solved everything. Did he mention any concerns? Anyone he was worried about? Chris shook his head slowly. Bobby didn't worry about much. He was confident, maybe too confident sometimes. What about enemies? Anyone who might want to hurt him? A pause. Chris glanced out the window. Bobby had left that world behind. The family history, that was ancient. He worked hard to build something clean, something legitimate. But Detective Santos noticed the careful phrasing. Worked hard, not succeeded. As she left Chris Dalka's office that afternoon, Detective Santos felt a familiar instinct, the kind every seasoned investigator learns to trust. Something didn't fit. The grief seemed real, but there was something else beneath it. Something controlled. Too controlled. Back at the station, the forensics team delivered their preliminary report. Bobby Mancuso had died from blunt force trauma to the head. The wound pattern suggested he'd been struck from behind with a heavy object, possibly a marble bookend found near the body, though it had been wiped clean. Toxicology revealed high levels of alcohol in his system, but no drugs. The timeline suggested Bobby had been drinking with someone he trusted, someone who'd shared that bottle of scotch with him, someone who'd stayed late into the night, someone who knew exactly how to make a murder look like an accident. Detective Santos stared at the crime scene photos spread across her desk. The penthouse, the body, the two glasses, the wiped fingerprints, and she asked herself the question that would haunt the investigation for months. Who drinks with their victim before they kill them? March 2021. Denver thawed slowly. Snow melted into slush along 16th Street Mall. The city returned to its rhythm. Coffee shops filled. Joggers reclaimed the trails along Cherry Creek. Construction crews resumed their work. But the death of Bobby Mancuso lingered like smoke. Detective Maria Santos wasn't sleeping well. She'd spent weeks interviewing Bobby's associates, reviewing financial records, and reconstructing his final days. Every lead seemed to evaporate. Every witness had the same story. Bobby was beloved, successful, untouchable. No one had a motive. No one had an opportunity. It was as if the killer had simply vanished into the expensive air of downtown Denver. But Santos had learned long ago that silence is never empty. Silence is where secrets hide. She returned to the forensics reports. The murder weapon, the marble bookend, had been wiped clean, but microscopic analysis revealed traces of leather fibers. Expensive leather, the kind found in high-end gloves. Premeditation, not passion. This wasn't a spontaneous act of violence. Someone had planned this. The two scotch glasses haunted her. One belonged to Bobby. The other had been wiped, but the positioning suggested a long conversation. Whoever killed Bobby had sat with him, talked with him, maybe even laughed with him before delivering the fatal blow. Santos pulled phone records. Bobby's cell showed calls and texts to dozens of contacts in the days before his death. Business partners, contractors, his assistant Linda, his sister in Phoenix. But one number appeared more frequently than any other. Christopher Dalka. They'd exchanged over 40 texts in the week leading up to Bobby's death. Most were mundane, meeting confirmations, document questions, dinner plans. But the final text from Bobby, sent at 9:47 p.m. on February 13th, caught Santos's attention. "We need to talk about the California deal. Tonight. Come by." Chris's response came 3 minutes later. On my way. That text was sent less than 2 hours before the coroner estimated Bobby's time of death. Santos requested Chris Delca's phone records. His attorney, ironically Chris had to hire his own lawyer, initially resisted, citing attorney-client privilege and privacy concerns. But after a judge signed a warrant, the records were handed over. What they revealed was disturbing. On the night of February 13th, Chris's phone pinged off cell towers showing his movement from his home in Cherry Creek to downtown Denver. He arrived at Bobby's building at 10:14 p.m. His phone remained in that location until 12:51 a.m., nearly 3 hours. Then it moved back toward Cherry Creek, arriving at his home at 1:23 a.m. When Detective Santos brought Chris back in for questioning on March 18th, his demeanor had shifted. The grief was still there, but now it was wrapped in defensiveness. His new attorney, a sharp woman named Rebecca Lawson, sat beside him, monitoring every question. "Chris, why didn't you mention you saw Bobby the night he died?" Santos asked calmly. "I didn't think it mattered," Chris replied, his voice tight. "I wasn't hiding anything. We met for drinks. We talked business. I left. He was alive when I walked out that door. What time did you leave?" "Around midnight. Maybe a little after." "Your phone records show you left at 12:51 a.m. That's almost 1 in the morning. What were you doing for nearly 3 hours?" "We were talking, catching up. We hadn't had real time together in weeks." "What did you talk about?" Chris hesitated. Rebecca Lawson leaned in, whispering something. Chris nodded. "The California deal. Bobby wanted my advice on structuring the contracts." "That's it? 3 hours to discuss contracts?" "We also talked about personal things. His sister, my daughter's college applications, life." Santos leaned forward. "Did you argue?" "No. Not even a little?" "No. We were friends. Best friends." "Then why did Bobby send you a text that said we need to talk like it was urgent? That doesn't sound like a casual catch-up." Chris's jaw tightened. Bobby was dramatic sometimes. Everything felt urgent to him. "Was he drunk when you left?" "He'd had a few drinks, but he was coherent." "Did you drink with him?" "Yes, a glass or two." "From the bottle of scotch in the living room?" "Yes." "Then why were your fingerprints not on the second glass?" The question landed like a punch. Chris's face paled slightly. Rebecca Lawson interjected immediately. "Detective, unless you're charging my client with something, this interview is over." Santos held Chris's gaze. "I'm just trying to understand what happened. Your best friend is dead. You were the last person to see him alive. And somehow there's no trace of you in that room except your word." Chris stood abruptly. "I told you what happened. I left. Bobby was alive. If you want to accuse me of something, arrest me. Otherwise, we're done here." They walked out. Santos watched them leave, frustration boiling under her calm exterior. She knew Chris was lying. She could feel it. But knowing and proving were two different things. The investigation expanded. Santos's team interviewed everyone connected to the California deal Chris had mentioned. The development firm based in San Diego confirmed the $20 million agreement. But when Santos dug deeper, she found something strange. The deal had been structured in an unusual way. Payments routed through a consulting company registered in Delaware, a shell company, untraceable ownership. Bobby's financial advisor, a cautious man named Gerald Simmons, reluctantly admitted that Bobby had been nervous about the California arrangement. "He called me 2 weeks before he died," Gerald said. "He asked me to review the contracts. He said something felt off. He didn't trust the terms." "Did he say why?" "No, but he mentioned Chris had pushed hard for the deal. Bobby wondered if Chris had a financial stake he wasn't disclosing. That was the crack Santos had been looking for. She subpoenaed Chris Delca's financial records. It took weeks. His attorneys fought every step. But eventually, the documents arrived. What they revealed was devastating. Christopher Delca was drowning in debt. His law practice, which appeared successful on the surface, was hemorrhaging money. He'd made risky investments in cryptocurrency that collapsed in 2020. He'd borrowed heavily against his home. He owed over $3 million to various creditors, some of whom were sending increasingly aggressive collection notices. But 4 days after Bobby's death, a payment of $2 million was deposited into one of Chris's offshore accounts. The source was listed as a consulting fee from the Delaware shell company tied to the California deal. Santos felt the pieces clicking into place. Chris hadn't just been Bobby's attorney. He'd been stealing from him. The California deal wasn't legitimate. It was a setup. a way to siphon money from Bobby's company into Chris's pocket. And when Bobby started asking questions, when he realized what his brother had done, Chris had to silence him. On April 22nd, Detective Santos presented her findings to the district attorney. The evidence was circumstantial but damning: motive, opportunity, financial desperation, and a timeline that placed Chris at the scene during the murder window. The DA authorized an arrest warrant. On April 24th at 6 a.m., Denver police surrounded Christopher Dalka's home in Cherry Creek. The neighborhood, known for its sprawling estates and manicured lawns, watched in shock as Chris was led out in handcuffs, still wearing his pajamas, his face frozen in disbelief. The arrest made national news within hours. Denver attorney arrested in mafia-linked murder case. Trusted friend charged with killing philanthropist Bobby Mancuso. The story exploded across social media. Reporters camped outside the courthouse. Bobby's family released a statement expressing their devastation and their faith in the justice system. But Detective Santos knew this was only the beginning. Arresting someone and convicting them were two entirely different battles. Chris Dalka hired one of the best defense teams money could buy, and he still had money, hidden in accounts the police hadn't yet uncovered. As Santos stood outside the courthouse that afternoon, watching news vans circle like vultures, she thought about Bobby Mancuso, a man who'd spent his life trying to outrun his family's dark legacy, only to be betrayed by the person he trusted most. A man who'd believed loyalty was sacred, friendship was forever. He'd been wrong, and that mistake had cost him everything. June 2021. Summer arrived in Denver with a vengeance. The sun beat down on the city, turning glass buildings into mirrors of light, baking the pavement until it shimmered. But inside the Lindsay Flanagan courthouse, the atmosphere was ice cold. The trial of Christopher Dalka began on June 14th. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, true crime enthusiasts, members of Denver's elite who couldn't believe one of their own was sitting in the defendant's chair. Bobby Mancuso's family occupied the front row, his younger sister Elena, her face a mask of grief and rage. Beside her sat Bobby's elderly mother, Maria Mancuso, her hands trembling as she clutched a rosary. The prosecution was led by Assistant District Attorney David Brennan, a sharp, methodical lawyer known for his meticulous case preparation. Across from him sat Chris Dalka's defense team, led by Jonathan Pierce, a legendary criminal attorney from Los Angeles who'd made his career dismantling seemingly airtight cases. Christopher Dalka sat at the defense table, impeccably dressed in a navy suit, his expression carefully neutral. But those who looked closely could see the strain, the tightness around his eyes, the way his hands occasionally trembled before he clasped them together. In her opening statement, Ada Brennan painted a devastating portrait. He described Bobby Mancuso as a man who'd worked tirelessly to redeem his family's name, to build something honorable from a tainted legacy. And he described Christopher Dalka as the serpent in that garden, a man consumed by greed, drowning in debt, who saw his best friend not as a brother, but as a solution to his financial ruin. The evidence will show, Brennan said, his voice echoing through the silent courtroom, that Christopher Dalka systematically stole millions of dollars from Robert Mancuso, that when Bobby discovered the theft, when he confronted his so-called friend, Mr. Dalka made a choice. He chose money over loyalty. He chose murder over honesty. And on the night of February 13th, 2021, he took a man's life to cover up his crimes. The defense, however, had a different story. Jonathan Pierce stood slowly, his movements deliberate, his voice calm. He acknowledged that Chris had been at Bobby's penthouse that night. He acknowledged they'd been drinking, talking, discussing business. But he insisted that Chris had left Bobby alive and well shortly after midnight. The prosecution wants you to believe this is a simple story, Pierce said, looking directly at the jury. A greedy man kills his friend for money. But life is rarely that simple. And neither is death. The truth is, Bobby Mancuso lived in a dangerous world, a world connected to organized crime, to powerful people who don't forgive debts or betrayals. The prosecution is desperate to pin this on Chris Dalka, because the alternative is too complicated, too messy, too hard to prove. But hard doesn't mean impossible, and the truth deserves more than the easy answer. The trial unfolded over 3 intense weeks. The prosecution methodically built its case. Detective Maria Santos testified for 2 full days, walking the jury through the investigation, the crime scene, The wiped fingerprints, the phone records, the financial evidence showing Chris's mounting debts and the suspicious $2 million payment. Forensic experts testified about the leather fibers found on the murder weapon, noting they were consistent with expensive gloves. Cell phone data placed Chris at the scene during the window of Bobby's death. Financial analysts traced the complex web of shell companies and offshore accounts, showing how money had been siphoned from Bobby's business into Chris's control. The most powerful testimony came from Gerald Simmons, Bobby's financial advisor. He described Bobby's growing suspicion about the California deal, his concern that Chris was hiding something. Bobby told me, 2 days before he died, that he was going to confront Chris, Gerald said, his voice heavy. He said if Chris had betrayed him, their friendship was over. But the defense fought back hard. Jonathan Pierce systematically attacked every piece of evidence. The wiped glass? Anyone could have wiped it. The cell phone data? It only proved Chris was there, not that he'd committed murder. The financial irregularities? Complex business deals always involved offshore accounts and consulting fees. Pierce called his own experts who testified that the injuries to Bobby's head were consistent with a fall, that Bobby, heavily intoxicated, could have stumbled and struck his head on the marble bookend after Chris left. The prosecution's narrative of premeditated murder, Pierce argued, was built on circumstantial evidence and assumptions. Then came the defense's star witness, Christopher Dalka himself. On June 30th, Chris took the stand. His attorney had carefully prepared him. He was calm, composed, his voice steady. He acknowledged his financial troubles openly. "I made bad investments," he admitted. "I was ashamed. I didn't want Bobby to know I was struggling." "Why not?" Pierce asked gently. "Because Bobby had always been the successful one, the golden child. I didn't want him to see me as a failure." "Did you steal from him?" "No. The California deal was legitimate. The payments I received were consulting fees I'd earned structuring the transaction. Everything was documented." "Did you kill Robert Mancuso?" Chris looked directly at the jury, his eyes brimming with tears. "Bobby was my brother. I loved him. I would never hurt him. Never." "What happened that night?" Chris took a breath. "We drank. We talked. He asked me about the California deal. I explained how it worked. He seemed satisfied. Around midnight, I told him I needed to get home. He walked me to the door. He was tipsy but fine. He was alive. I swear to God he was alive when I left." "Then what happened?" "I don't know. Maybe he fell. Maybe someone else came after I left. All I know is I didn't hurt him." The cross-examination was brutal. Ada Brennan hammered Chris for hours, pointing out inconsistencies, challenging his explanations for the offshore accounts, demanding to know why he'd wiped the glass clean. "I didn't wipe any glass," Chris insisted. "Then whose fingerprints are missing? Who else was there?" "I don't know." "You don't know, or you won't say." "I don't know." But Brennan's most devastating moment came when he presented a piece of evidence the defense hadn't anticipated. A security camera from a neighboring building had captured footage of the parking garage beneath Bobby's building. At 12:53 a.m., Chris Dalka's black Mercedes was seen leaving. But at 11:47 p.m., the same camera showed Chris entering the building, carrying a small leather bag. "What was in that bag, Mr. Dalka?" Brennan asked. "I don't remember. Documents, maybe. My laptop. Or perhaps a pair of gloves you plan to use." "No. And when you left over an hour later, you weren't carrying that bag anymore." "Where did it go?" Chris faltered. "I must have left it at Bobby's." "Convenient. Because the police never found it." The jury watched this exchange with intense focus. And for the first time, Chris Dalka looked genuinely afraid. The prosecution's closing argument was devastating. Brennan wove all the evidence into a coherent narrative: motive, opportunity, means, and consciousness of guilt. "Christopher Dalka didn't just kill his friend," Brennan said, his voice heavy with emotion. "He killed the man who trusted him most in this world, and he did it in cold blood, with premeditation, with the calculated cruelty of someone who values money more than human life." The defense's closing was equally passionate. Pierce reminded the jury of the presumption of innocence, the burden of proof, the fact that circumstantial evidence could point in multiple directions. "Reasonable doubt isn't just a legal term," Pierce said. "It's a moral obligation. And in this case, doubt isn't just reasonable, it's unavoidable." The jury deliberated for 4 days. Denver held its breath. Outside the courthouse, protesters gathered, some supporting Bobby's family, others insisting Chris was innocent. The media ran endless speculation. Legal analysts debated the strength of the prosecution's case. On July 8th, the jury returned. The courtroom was silent except for the rustle of clothing as everyone stood. The forewoman, a middle-aged teacher from Aurora, handed the verdict to the judge. In the matter of the people of Colorado versus Christopher Michael Dalka, on the charge of murder in the first degree, how do you find? The forewoman's voice was clear, unwavering. We find the defendant guilty. The courtroom erupted. Elena Mancuso collapsed into tears. Maria Mancuso clutched her rosary tighter, her lips moving in silent prayer. Journalists sprinted for the exits, phones already to their ears. And Christopher Dalka, the man who'd spent 20 years as Bobby Mancuso's most trusted friend, sat motionless, his face drained of color, his world collapsing around him. Detective Maria Santos, sitting in the back row, felt no triumph, only exhaustion. Justice had been served, but it felt hollow. Bobby Mancuso was still dead. A friendship had been destroyed, and the darkness that had haunted the Mancuso family for generations had claimed another victim. As Chris was led away in handcuffs, he turned one last time to look at Bobby's family. His expression was unreadable: regret, defiance, sorrow, or perhaps just the empty realization that he'd gambled everything and lost. The trial was over, but the story wasn't finished yet. August 2021. Denver's summer was fading into memory. The evenings grew cooler. Leaves on the trees along Spear Boulevard began their slow transformation to gold and crimson. The city was healing, or at least trying to. Bobby Mancuso's name remained on buildings and plaques, a permanent reminder of a life cut tragically short. Christopher Dalka sat in a maximum security facility, awaiting sentencing, facing life in prison. The case should have been closed, but Detective Maria Santos couldn't let it go. Something about the trial nagged at her. Chris's defense attorney, Jonathan Pierce, had repeatedly hinted at darker forces, organized crime connections, dangerous people in Bobby's past. The jury had dismissed it as desperation, smoke, and mirrors from a defense team with nothing solid to work with. But Santos had been a cop long enough to know that smoke usually means fire. She returned to Bobby's files. Not the recent business records, but the old ones. Documents from his father's generation, from the years when the Mancuso family was transitioning from Chicago to Denver, from illegal operations to legitimate business. She found dusty boxes in a storage unit Bobby had maintained, filled with contracts, letters, and photographs from the 1980s and 90s. And there, buried in the paperwork, she found something that changed everything. A series of letters exchanged between Bobby's father, Vincent Mancuso, and a man named Dominic Russo. Santos recognized the name immediately. Russo had been a capo in the Chicago outfit, a high-ranking member of organized crime who'd mysteriously disappeared in 1997. The letters were cryptic, written in coded language, but their meaning was clear. Vincent Mancuso hadn't just left the criminal world. He'd taken something with him. Money, lots of it. Money that belonged to the outfit. The debt had never been repaid. And debts to the Mafia don't disappear with time. They compound. They pass to the next generation like a genetic curse. Santos dug deeper. She contacted FBI agents who'd worked organized crime cases in the 90s. One retired agent, Frank Morelli, remembered the Mancuso family well. Vincent was smart, Morelli said during a phone call. He played both sides. He worked with us, gave us information on smaller players, but he kept the big secrets, and he died before we could ever flip him completely. What about Bobby? Santos asked. Did he know about his father's debts? Probably. But Bobby was clean. He worked hard to distance himself. He thought if he kept his head down, built legitimate businesses, the old world would leave him alone. Did it? There was a long pause. I don't know. But I'll tell you this. Debts like that don't just vanish. Someone, somewhere, was keeping track. Santos's next call was to Elena Mancuso, Bobby's sister. They met at a quiet cafe in Cherry Creek. Elena was still grieving, her eyes perpetually red-rimmed, but she agreed to talk. Did Bobby ever mention threats? Santos asked. Anyone from your father's past contacting him? Elena hesitated, then nodded slowly. About 6 months before he died, Bobby got a call. Late at night. I was visiting him. He took it in another room, but I could hear him arguing. When he came back, he looked shaken. I asked what was wrong. He just said, "The past never stays buried." Did he explain? No, But he started acting different after that, more paranoid. He changed his security codes. He stopped going to certain places, and he started pulling back from Chris. Chris? Why? I don't know exactly, but Bobby mentioned once that Chris knew too much, that their friendship had become complicated. Santos felt the pieces shifting again, forming a new pattern. What if Chris hadn't acted alone? What if he'd been working with someone, or for someone? She reviewed Chris's phone records again, this time going back months. Most calls were routine, clients, colleagues, family, but there was one number that appeared sporadically, always from burner phones, always brief. The calls had increased in frequency in the months before Bobby's death. Santos traced the numbers to prepaid phones purchased with cash in different parts of Denver. Untraceable, but the timing was suspicious. Each call seemed to coincide with Chris's financial troubles worsening, with Bobby's suspicions growing. Then came the break she'd been hoping for. A confidential informant in Denver's underworld reached out through back channels. He had information about Bobby Mancuso's death. Santos met him in an abandoned warehouse in 5 Points, the neighborhood where Denver's jazz scene had once thrived, now a mix of gentrification and decay. The informant, a man Santos knew only as Ray, was nervous. He smoked constantly, his hands shaking. "I shouldn't be talking to you," he said. But Bobby was a good guy. He didn't deserve what happened. "What do you know?" "There's a crew working out of Chicago. Same people Vincent Mancuso screwed over back in the day. They've been watching the family for years, waiting for the right time to collect." "Collect what?" "Money, respect, blood. Take your pick." Word is, they approached Bobby last year, told him he owed them $5 million for his daddy's sins. Bobby refused, said he wasn't responsible for what his father did. "So they killed him?" Ray shook his head. "Not directly. Too messy. Too much attention. But they knew about Chris. They knew he was desperate. They made him an offer. 'Help us get to Bobby. We'll clear your debts and make you rich.'" Santos felt her pulse quicken. Chris was working for them? More like they used him? Chris didn't want Bobby dead. He just wanted money. But once you make a deal with those people, you don't get to control the terms. "Do you have proof?" "No. But the night Bobby died, there was someone else in that building. Someone who came after Chris left. They finished what Chris started, made sure Bobby wouldn't survive. Chris thinks he killed Bobby, but he didn't. He just softened him up." Santos pressed for names, details, anything concrete. But Ray had given all he could. "I've said too much already," he muttered, crushing his cigarette under his boot. "You want the truth? Look at who benefited. Not just Chris, someone bigger. Someone who wanted that California deal to go through because it was how they planned to launder money into Denver's real estate market." He disappeared into the shadows, leaving Santos with more questions than answers. Over the next week, Santos worked around the clock. She contacted federal authorities. She reviewed the California development deal in excruciating detail. And she found it, buried in the corporate structure of the Delaware Shell Company, hidden behind layers of nominees and offshore trusts, was a connection to a holding company linked to families with documented ties to organized crime. The California deal wasn't just business, it was a mechanism, a way to wash dirty money through Bobby's legitimate operation. And Chris Dalka, drowning in debt and desperate for a lifeline, had been the perfect pawn. But proving it was another matter. The evidence was circumstantial, the connections murky. The FBI opened an investigation, but warned Santos it would take years to untangle the web. Chris Dalka's conviction would stand. He was at the scene. He had motive. He participated in the events that led to Bobby's death. Whether he struck the fatal blow himself or someone else finished the job, he was guilty. On September 15th, Christopher Dalka was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom was packed again. Elena Mancuso read a victim impact statement, her voice breaking as she described the brother she'd lost, the betrayal that compounded her grief. When asked if he had anything to say, Chris stood slowly. His face was gaunt, aged by months in custody and the weight of his guilt. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," he said quietly. "I was desperate. I made a deal with people I should have run from. And Bobby paid the price. I'll carry that for the rest of my life. I'm sorry. For whatever it's worth, I'm sorry. It wasn't worth much." The judge handed down the sentence without hesitation. Chris was led away. He didn't look back this time. Detective Maria Santos stood outside the courthouse that afternoon. watching the news crews pack up their equipment. The case was officially closed. Justice, in its legal form, had been served. But Santos knew the truth was more complicated, more sinister than what had been presented in court. Bobby Mancuso had spent his entire adult life trying to escape his family's shadow. He'd donated millions to charity, built legitimate businesses, employed hundreds of people, contributed to Denver's growth and prosperity. But in the end, the sins of his father had found him anyway. The debt had come due, and the Mafia's patience, legendary and terrifying, had finally run out. Chris Dalka had been the instrument but not the architect. He was a desperate man who'd made a catastrophic choice, who'd allowed himself to be used by forces far more powerful and ruthless than he understood. He'd believed he could control the situation, take the money, and walk away. But the moment he'd accepted that first payment, the moment he'd agreed to set Bobby up, he'd signed his own life away too. Santos thought about the 2 glasses of scotch on Bobby's coffee table. 2 friends drinking together one last time. One unaware he was about to die. The other unaware he was being used as a pawn in a much larger game. Both trapped by history, by greed, by the gravitational pull of a criminal world that never truly lets go. In the weeks that followed, the FBI's investigation expanded. Federal agents raided the offices of the Delaware Shell Company. Several individuals connected to the California deal were indicted on money laundering charges. The evidence Santos had uncovered helped build a RICO case against organized crime figures operating in multiple states. It would take years to prosecute, but the wheels of justice, slow as they were, had begun to turn. Bobby's family established a foundation in his name, dedicated to helping young people in underserved communities escape cycles of poverty and crime, a fitting legacy for a man who'd tried so hard to break free from his own family's dark history. Denver slowly moved on. New scandals replaced the Mancuso case in the headlines. The Ritz-Carlton penthouse where Bobby died was eventually sold to a tech entrepreneur from California, who knew nothing of its bloody history. Guard and Grace, the steakhouse where Bobby and Chris had their last meal together, remained popular, though some regulars avoided the corner booth where the 2 men had celebrated what they didn't know would be their final dinner. Christopher Dalka adapted to prison life as well as anyone could. He kept to himself, read constantly, and according to guards, spent hours writing letters he never sent. To whom, no one knew. Perhaps to Bobby's family. Perhaps to his own daughter, who'd changed her name and moved to Seattle, desperate to distance herself from her father's crimes. Perhaps to Bobby himself, confessions scrawled on paper that would never be read. In November 2021, 9 months after Bobby's death, Detective Santos received an anonymous package at the police station. Inside was a flash drive and a note written in neat block letters. The whole truth. The flash drive contained audio recordings, conversations between Chris Dalka and an unidentified man with a thick Chicago accent. The recordings dated back 8 months before Bobby's murder. In them, Chris was clearly being manipulated, threatened, and coerced. The man offered solutions to Chris's financial problems in exchange for information about Bobby's business, his routines, his vulnerabilities. In the final recording, dated February 10th, just 3 days before Bobby's death, Chris sounded panicked. "I can't do this anymore," he said. "Bobby's my friend, I won't hurt him." The Chicago voice turned cold. "You're already in too deep. You think you can just walk away? You know what we do to people who back out? And it's not just you, Chris, it's your daughter, your ex-wife, everyone you love. You'll do exactly what we tell you when we tell you. Are we clear?" A long pause. Then Chris's voice broken. "Yes, we're clear." Santos listened to the recordings 3 times. They didn't exonerate Chris. He'd still participated, still been present, still failed to stop what happened. But they confirmed what Ray had told her. Chris had been a tool, not the mastermind. A desperate man exploited by professionals. She considered releasing the recordings to the media, to Chris's attorneys for a possible appeal. But after consulting with the FBI and the district attorney's office, the decision was made to keep them sealed as part of the ongoing federal investigation. Releasing them could compromise the larger case against organized crime figures who were still operating. Still dangerous. It was a bitter pill. The public narrative on me that Chris was a cold-blooded killer motivated purely by greed wasn't entirely accurate, but the full truth was too complex, too dangerous to reveal. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Santos visited Bobby Mancuso's grave one cold afternoon in December. It was located in Mount Olivet Cemetery, surrounded by generations of Denver's Italian-American community. His headstone was elegant but understated. Robert Vincent Mancuso, beloved son, brother, friend, 1973-2021. She stood there for a long time, watching snow begin to fall, coating the cemetery in white silence. She thought about all the lives destroyed by this case. Bobby, dead at 48, his dreams of redemption buried with him. Chris, alive but imprisoned, his life effectively over. Bobby's mother, who'd lost her son and discovered her family's past, had murdered him. Chris's daughter, traumatized and exiled from her own father. And for what? Money, old debts, the arrogance of men who believed they could outrun their histories or exploit the desperation of others. "I got him, Bobby," Santos said quietly to the headstone. "I know it's not enough. I know it doesn't bring you back, but I got him." The wind picked up, scattering snow across the grave. In the distance, Denver's skyline rose against the gray winter sky. Buildings Bobby had helped build. Streets he'd helped revitalize. A city he'd loved despite its indifference to his efforts at redemption. Detective Maria Santos turned and walked back to her car. The case was closed. The files would be archived. Eventually, people would forget. Denver would move on, as cities always do, burying its scandals under new construction and new stories. But Santos would remember. She'd remember the 2 glasses of scotch, the wiped fingerprints, the leather gloves, the shell companies, the phone calls from burner phones, the weight of history that crushed a man who'd tried so hard to escape it. She'd remember that in Denver in 2021, the Mafia had reminded the city that it hadn't disappeared. It had just learned to wear better suits, work through lawyers and legitimate businesses, and strike from the shadows when necessary. And she'd remember Bobby Mancuso, not as a victim, not as a mob legacy, but as a man who'd tried to be better than his bloodline, who'd failed not because he wasn't good enough, but because the world he'd been born into wouldn't let him go. As Santos drove away from the cemetery, her radio crackled with a new call. Another case, another tragedy, another piece of Denver's darkness waiting to be uncovered. She answered it, because that was the job. You don't fix everything. You don't save everyone. But you keep going. You find the truth. You hold people accountable. And you hope, against all evidence to the contrary, that justice means something, even when it comes too late to save the people who needed it most. 3 years later, in 2024, the FBI's investigation culminated in the indictment of 14 individuals connected to organized crime operations spanning from Chicago to Denver to the West Coast. The California development deal was exposed as a massive money laundering scheme. Several high-ranking figures in Chicago's underworld were arrested. Others fled to countries without extradition treaties. Christopher Dalka was quietly offered a deal: testify against the people who'd manipulated him, and his sentence would be reconsidered. He refused. "I made my choices," he told prosecutors. "I live with them, but I won't become a rat. That's not who I am." Perhaps it was his last shred of the code he'd learned from Bobby. Perhaps it was fear for his family's safety. Perhaps it was simply exhaustion. Whatever the reason, Chris remained in prison, a forgotten footnote to a case that had briefly captivated the nation. Bobby Mancuso's foundation continued to grow, helping thousands of young people escape poverty and violence. His name, once tainted by family history, gradually became synonymous with hope and second chances, a legacy he would have appreciated. Detective Maria Santos retired from the Denver Police Department in 2026. She'd solved dozens of cases in her career, put away murderers and rapists and thieves. But the Mancuso case was the one that stayed with her, the one that reminded her that in the shadows of every city, old evils lurk, waiting for the right moment, the right weakness, the right victim. Denver continued to grow. New buildings rose. New residents arrived. The city's tech sector boomed. Life went on. But sometimes on quiet winter evenings when snow fell softly over downtown and the city lights reflected off glass towers, those who remembered would think about Bobby Mancuso, about a man who tried to outrun his shadow and failed, about betrayal dressed as friendship, about the terrible weight of inherited sin, and they'd remember that the Mafia hadn't disappeared. It had simply evolved, adapted, learned to kill with contracts instead of bullets, to destroy lives with debt instead of violence, to hide behind legitimate businesses while maintaining the same brutal calculus that had always defined organized crime: power, profit, and the absolute certainty that debts must always be paid, even if it takes a generation, even if it destroys the innocent, even if it shocks an entire city when the truth finally comes to light. The Denver Mafia case of 2021 was solved. The suspect's identity shocked the city, but the shadows that case revealed? They remain, waiting, watching, patient as only predators can be. Because in the end, some legacies can't be escaped, some debts can never be fully repaid, and some truths are too dark for daylight. All you can do is remember, learn, and watch the shadows a little more carefully. If this story gripped you, if it made you think differently about loyalty, legacy, and the hidden darkness in every city, then we've done our job. The Denver Mafia case reminds us that real evil rarely announces itself. It wears expensive suits. It drinks scotch in penthouses. It masquerades as friendship while calculating betrayal. This channel is dedicated to bringing you true crime stories that matter, investigations that reveal not just who committed the crime, but why the world allowed it to happen. Stories about real people, real choices, and real consequences. If you want more deep dives into cases that shocked cities and changed lives, hit that subscribe button right now. Turn on notifications so you never miss an upload, and share this video with anyone who appreciates true crime done with respect, depth, and unflinching honesty. Drop a comment below. What shocked you most about this case? Did you suspect Chris from the beginning, or did the truth surprise you? We read every comment, and your insights fuel our next investigations. Thank you for staying with us through all 4 chapters. Thank you for caring about Bobby Mancuso's story. And thank you for understanding that sometimes the most important stories are the ones that refuse to let us look away from uncomfortable truths. Until next time, stay curious, stay critical, and remember, the shadows are always deeper than they appear. Subscribe now. More stories are coming. The truth is waiting.